Sometimes life knocks you down so hard, you wonder if you'll ever stand again. That's exactly where Darren found himself, living alone in a weathered shack by the creek, ridiculed by neighbors who called him the drifter dad. His only friend was Rook, a loyal German shepherd who never judged him for his failures. One afternoon, while walking along the water's edge, Rook started digging frantically at something half buried in the mud. Darren helped pull it free, a small metal box, rusted and forgotten. Inside was a single golden key. That key would lead Darren on a journey he never expected, uncovering secrets about his late father and a forgotten piece of town history. What he discovered didn't bring him wealth, but something far more valuable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the gaps in the shack's wooden slats, casting thin golden lines across Darren's face. He woke to the sound of the creek, that constant gentle murmur that had become the rhythm of his days. Rook was already up, sitting by the door with the patience only a dog could muster, waiting for their morning routine to begin. Darren swung his legs off the narrow cot, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back. 53 years old, and his body kept a careful inventory of every hard year, every mistake, every night spent on surfaces not meant for sleeping. He pulled on his worn jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades, then pushed open the door to greet the day. The shack sat on a narrow strip of land where Willow Creek bent around a stand of old cottonwoods. It wasn't much, 12 feet by 16, cobbled together from salvaged wood and corrugated metal. The roof leaked in 3 places when it rained, and the winter wind found every crack and seam. But it was his, in the way that anything becomes yours when you've got nowhere else to go. Rook bounded ahead to the water's edge, his dark coat gleaming in the morning sun. Darren followed, carrying the battered coffee pot he'd filled from the creek the night before. He'd rigged up a small fire pit with stones and kept a supply of dry wood under a tarp. Simple living, his father might have called it. Rock Bottom, the town of Millstream, called it. Millstream itself lay a mile upstream, a town of 3,000. Souls who'd made their peace with being forgotten by the wider world. Main Street had the usual markers of rural American life. A general store, a diner, a post office that doubled as a community bulletin board, 2 churches competing for the same dwindling congregations. The old mill that gave the town its name had closed in 1987, and nothing had quite filled the gap it left behind. Darren had lived in Millstream once, back when he'd been someone different, back when he'd had a house on Maple Street, a job at the county road department, and a wife named Patricia who'd believed in him longer than he deserved. They'd married. Young, too young probably, but they'd made it work for nearly 20 years. No children, which Patricia had mourned and Darren had secretly felt relieved about, though he'd never admitted that to anyone, even himself. The unraveling had been slow, then sudden. First came the budget cuts that eliminated his position. Then the months of unsuccessful job hunting, watching their savings evaporate like morning dew. Patricia had worked at the elementary school, but her salary couldn't carry them both. The arguments started small, little disagreements about spending, about priorities, then grew into something bigger and more bitter. By the end, they were just 2 people who'd run out of words that mattered. The divorce was finalized 3 years ago. Patricia got the house, which was fair since she'd paid most of the mortgage by then anyway. Darren had moved into a rental, then a cheaper rental, then into his truck when the unemployment ran out. The shack by the creek had been abandoned for years, probably illegal to live in, certainly not up to any kind of code, but nobody seemed to care enough to stop him. He'd found Rook about a year into his exile. The dog had been hanging around, the edge of town, thin and wary, with a scar across his shoulder that suggested a hard past of his own. Darren had started leaving scraps of food out, and eventually the dog had decided that this quiet, defeated man was worth trusting. They'd been inseparable ever since. The townspeople had their opinions about Darren, and they weren't shy about sharing them. The drifter dad, they called him, though he'd never been a father and hadn't drifted so much as fallen and stayed down. He saw it in their eyes when he walked into town for supplies, that mixture of pity and contempt that people reserve for those who've failed at the basic task of keeping their lives together. Mrs. Keating at the general store would serve him, but only after everyone else had been helped, and she'd count his crumpled bills twice, as if suspecting him of shorting her. The kids coming out of school would sometimes point and whisper. Once a group of teenagers had followed him for 2 blocks, their laughter sharp as broken glass, until Deputy Wolfe had told them to move along. Not everyone was cruel. Mrs. Pemberton at the library treated him with quiet dignity, never asking questions about why he spent so many afternoons reading in the corner chair. Old Reverend Sterling would nod to him on the street, a simple acknowledgement of shared humanity. But these small kindnesses only highlighted the larger absence of belonging. Darren had learned to make himself small, to move through the world without drawing attention. He fished in the creek for dinner, catfish mostly, and sometimes bass. He foraged for wild greens in the summer and learned which mushrooms were safe to eat. The general store's dumpster provided day-old bread and bruised produce that Mrs. Keating threw out with more enthusiasm than necessary. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. His father would have been disappointed. Lawrence Pritchard had been a man of quiet strength, someone who'd believed in hard work and helping your neighbors and leaving things better than you found them. He died when Darren was 31, a sudden heart attack that had taken him in his sleep. Darren had inherited almost nothing. His father had never been wealthy. Just a box of old photographs, some tools, and a worn compass that Darren kept meaning to repair, but never got around to. They'd never been especially close. Lawrence had been a man of few words, more comfortable with his hands than his heart. But in the years since his death, Darren had come to realize how little he'd actually known about his father's life. The man had worked at the mill for 30 years, been active in the community, volunteered at the church. Beyond that, Darren couldn't have told you much. Sometimes sitting by the creek with Rook's head in his lap, Darren would think about his father's last words to him. They'd been talking about Darren's marriage troubles, which were already starting to show cracks. Lawrence had looked at him with those steady grey eyes and said, "Some things are worth more than money, son. Remember that when you're figuring out what matters." At the time, Darren had nodded and felt vaguely patronized, the way adult children do when their parents offer wisdom they're not ready to hear. Now, years later, broke and alone, he understood that his father hadn't been talking about marriage or money at all. He'd been talking about something bigger, something Darren still couldn't quite name. The golden key sat on the wooden crate that served as Darren's bedside table. He'd cleaned it the night before, scrubbing away the mud to reveal intricate engravings along its shaft. It was old, that much was clear. Brass, or maybe bronze, heavy in the hand. The kind of key that opened something important. Rook had been strange about it from the moment they'd pulled it from the creek bed. The dog kept circling back to it, sniffing and whining softly, as if recognizing something Darren couldn't perceive. That restlessness had continued through the night, and now, as the morning sun climbed higher, Darren found himself picking up the key again, turning it over in his calloused hands. What did it open? And why had it been buried by the creek, sealed in a metal box that had clearly been placed there deliberately, not washed up by accident? The questions pulled at him with an insistence he hadn't felt in years. For so long, he'd simply existed, getting through each day without thought for tomorrow. But this key, this small piece of worked metal, had sparked something he'd thought was dead. Curiosity, purpose, the sense that maybe, just maybe, there was still something in this world meant for him to find. Darren looked at Rook, who was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes. "What do you think, boy?" he asked quietly. "Should we see where this leads?" Rook's tail swept the dirt floor twice, which Darren took as agreement. For the first time in 3 years, Darren Pritchard had somewhere to be. Darren spent the morning examining the key under the best light he could find. He'd positioned himself near the shack's single window, turning the metal over and over in his hands, tracing the engravings with his fingertips. The patterns were intricate, vines or branches maybe, though worn smooth by time. Along the key's shaft, barely visible, were tiny marks that might have been letters or numbers. Rook lay at his feet, unusually still, as if sensing that something important was unfolding. Every so often, the dog would lift his head and fix Darren with that knowing stare that made him wonder, not for the first time, just how much dogs really understood. By noon, Darren had decided. He couldn't solve this mystery alone. He needed help, which meant going into town, something he usually avoided, except when absolutely necessary. But the key had woken something in him, a determination that overrode his usual reluctance to face the judgment of Millstream's residents. He cleaned himself up as best he could, washed his face and hands in the creek, combed his hair with his fingers, pulled on his least worn shirt. It wasn't much, but dignity was where you found it. Rook walked beside him as they made their way along the path that led from the creek to Main Street. The town was quiet in that midday way small places have, when everyone's either at work or at home, and the streets belong to the patient and the purposeless. Darren kept his head up, refusing to shuffle or shrink. He had a legitimate reason to be here. He had a question that needed answering. The locksmith's shop sat between the hardware store and what used to be a barber shop. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Garrison's Locks and Keys, since 1962. Darren had never been inside, but he remembered the owner vaguely. An older man who'd sometimes been at the same community events his father had attended. A bell chimed as he pushed open the door. The shop was small and crowded, every surface covered with locks, keys and tools whose purposes Darren could only guess at. The smell of metal and machine oil hung in the air. "Be right with you," a voice called from the back room. Darren waited, his hand unconsciously touching the key in his pocket. Rook sat at his feet, well-behaved as always in public spaces. The man who emerged was in his 70s, maybe older, with a shock of white hair and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He wore a leather apron over a work shirt, and his hands had the permanent stains of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with metal. He stopped when he saw Darren, and something flickered across his face, recognition, maybe, or memory. "Darren Pritchard," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Mr. Garrison," Darren replied, relieved that the man's tone held neither pity nor contempt. "Just simple acknowledgement. Haven't seen you in here before. What can I do for you?" Darren pulled out the key and placed it on the counter. "I found this yesterday. I'm trying to figure out what it might open." Garrison picked up the key, and Darren watched the old man's expression shift from casual interest to something sharper. He reached for a magnifying glass and examined the key more closely, turning it slowly, studying the engravings and the wear patterns. "Where did you find this?" Garrison asked quietly. "By the creek. It was in a metal box, buried in the mud." The locksmith looked up, his eyes meeting Darren's, with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "This is old work. Really old. See these engravings? That's hand-done, not machine-cut. We're talking pre-1950s, maybe earlier. Can you tell what it opens?" Garrison set down the magnifying glass and leaned against the counter, still holding the key. "This is a specialty key. Not for a house or a car. Something more specific. A safe, maybe, or a strongbox. Could be a piece of furniture. Old desks and cabinets sometimes had locks like this. Is there any way to narrow it down?" The old man was quiet for a moment, his thumb rubbing across the key's surface in a gesture that seemed almost unconscious. "Your father," he said finally. "Lawrence. He was a good man." The shift in topic caught Darren off guard. "Yes, sir. He was. He helped a lot of people in this town." "Quietly, you understand. Not the kind to make a fuss about it." Garrison paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. There were things he was involved in that not everyone knew about. "Good things, but private?" Darren felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of things?" "That's not my story to tell. But I'll say this. If you found something your father wanted kept, there was probably a good reason for it." He handed the key back to Darren. "You might want to check the old buildings around town. The mill, maybe. The church storage building. The old town hall basement, if you can get access to it. Why those places specifically? Garrison smiled, but it was sad around the edges. Because those are the places where people used to gather when they needed help. Back in the day, I mean, before everything got so... He gestured vaguely, as if the right word for what the town had become was beyond him. Darren pocketed the key, his mind already racing ahead to these new possibilities. "Thank you, Mr. Garrison. I appreciate your time." "Darren," the locksmith said as he turned to leave, "be careful who you tell about this. Not everyone in this town appreciates people digging up the past." The warning hung in the air as Darren and Rook stepped back onto Main Street. The afternoon sun was bright now, almost harsh, and Darren squinted against it as he considered his next move. The library would have old town records. Maps, maybe, showing the buildings as they'd been decades ago. And Mrs. Pemberton was there, one of the few people in Millstream who'd shown him consistent kindness. If anyone would help him research without asking too many questions, it would be her. He started walking toward the library, Rook matching his pace. As they passed the diner, Darren caught sight of his reflection in the window. A thin man in worn clothes, with a dog at his side, and something like purpose in his stride. He barely recognized himself. Inside his pocket, the key felt warm against his leg, as if it held its own kind of heat. Or maybe that was just his imagination, fired up by possibility after years of feeling nothing but the cold weight of defeat. Behind him, through the diner's window, several townspeople had noticed him. Their conversation paused, heads turning to follow his progress down the street. By nightfall, word would spread. The drifter dad was up to something. Darren could feel their eyes like pressure against his back, but he didn't stop. He didn't turn around. He just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, toward whatever answers waited for him in the dusty archives of Millstream's forgotten history. The Millstream Public Library was a modest brick building that had served the community since 1923. It sat on a corner lot shaded by old maple trees, the leaves just beginning to turn gold at the edges. Darren tied Rook's leash to a bike rack outside. The dog would wait patiently, as he always did, and climbed the worn stone steps. Inside, the familiar smell of old books and furniture polish greeted him. The library was one of the few places in town where Darren had always felt welcome, or at least not unwelcome. Mrs. Pemberton had been the head librarian for nearly 30 years, and she possessed the rare gift of treating everyone who walked through her doors with the same quiet respect. She looked up from the circulation desk as he entered, her reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She was in her early 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that still held keen intelligence. "Darren," she said, her voice warm. "It's good to see you." "It's been a few weeks." "Yes, ma'am. I've been meaning to come by." He approached the desk, suddenly aware of how he must look, shabby and sun-worn compared to the neat order of her domain. "I was hoping you might help me with something." "Of course. What are you looking for?" He pulled out the key and placed it on the desk between them. "I found this by the creek. Mr. Garrison thinks it's old, pre-1950s. He suggested I look at town records, maybe old maps showing buildings from that era." Mrs. Pemberton picked up the key with careful fingers, examining it much as Garrison had done. But her reaction was different. Her expression softened, and something like recognition flickered in her eyes. "Where exactly did you find this?" she asked softly. "Buried in a metal box, near where the creek bends by my place." She was quiet for a long moment, turning the key over in her hands. Then she looked up at him, and Darren saw something in her face he couldn't quite read. Sadness, maybe, mixed with something that might have been hope. "Your father was a remarkable man," she said finally. It was the second time today someone had brought up his father in connection with the key. Mr. Garrison said something similar. "But nobody will tell me what he actually did." "Come with me," Mrs. Pemberton said, standing. "I'll show you the archives. But first, I want to tell you something." She led him through the main reading room to a door marked Staff Only. Beyond it was a narrow staircase leading down. The basement archives were cool and slightly damp, lined with metal shelves holding boxes and files that represented Millstream's documented history. Mrs. Pemberton pulled a step stool over to one of the higher shelves and retrieved a large flat box. She carried it to a table and opened it carefully, revealing old maps protected by tissue paper. "This is Millstream in 1947, she said, unfolding one of the maps. "Right after the war. The town was different then. More people, more hope. The mill was running 3 shifts. Darren studied the map. He could see familiar streets, but there were buildings marked that no longer existed, and some that still stood were labeled with different names. "Here," Mrs. Pemberton pointed, "the old mill, still standing, though nobody's used it in decades. Here's the First Methodist Church. That storage building behind it was built in 1949. And this," she tapped a location on the map, "was the original town hall before the fire in 1963. The basement survived, but the building above it was never rebuilt. These are the places Garrison mentioned." "Yes." She folded her hands on the table. "Darren, your father was part of something important in this town. After the Depression and then after the war, there were a lot of families struggling. Jobs were scarce, money was tight, and people were proud, too proud to ask for help sometimes. What did he do? There was a group. I don't know all the names, but your father was one of them. They pooled what resources they had and helped people quietly. Paid rent for families about to be evicted, covered medical bills, made sure children had winter coats. They called themselves—" She smiled slightly. "Well, they didn't call themselves anything, really. They were just neighbors helping neighbors." Darren felt something tight in his chest. Why didn't I know about this? Because they didn't want recognition. That wasn't the point. And over the years, as those families got back on their feet and the town stabilized, the group gradually dissolved. People forgot, or maybe they never knew in the first place. She touched the key gently. But they kept records. They had to, for accountability. And they met somewhere private. You think this key opens something related to those records? I think it's possible. She reached into the box and pulled out another map, this one from 1955. There were rumors of a place they maintained, not in town proper, but close by. Somewhere they could meet without drawing attention. Darren leaned over the map, searching for anything near the creek. His eyes caught on a marking he hadn't noticed before, a small square symbol on the outskirts with the notation, "Community Reserve." "What's this?" "I don't know," Mrs. Pemberton admitted. "I've always wondered about it. The notation appears on maps from the late 40s through the early 60s, then it disappears. No records explain what it was. Can I see where this would be in relation to where I'm living now?" She pulled out a modern town map, and they compared the two. Darren felt his pulse quicken as he realized the community reserve marking was less than a quarter-mile from his shack, deeper in the woods beyond the creek. "I've walked through those woods," he said. "I've never seen any buildings. Maybe it's not a building, or maybe it's so overgrown now that it's hard to spot." Mrs. Pemberton began carefully folding the old maps. "May I make copies of these for you? Would you?" "Of course." "And Darren—" She paused, her expression serious. "I'm glad you're looking into this. Your father would be glad too." While she went to make the copies, Darren remained in the archives, studying the maps more carefully. He traced the creek's path with his finger, noting where it bent and curved. The marked location would be upstream from his shack, in an area thick with old-growth trees. Mrs. Pemberton returned with the copies in a manila folder. "There's something else," she said, pulling a slim volume from another shelf. "This is a town directory from 1952. It lists residents and their occupations. Your father's entry mentions volunteer work with community improvement projects." Darren opened the book to the marked page. There it was. Pritchard, Lawrence, millworker, volunteer coordinator. Brief and unrevealing, but it confirmed what she'd told him. "How many other people in town know about this?" he asked. "Not many. Most of the people who were directly involved have passed on. Those who received help either never knew where it came from, or they've forgotten, or—" She hesitated. "They've chosen not to remember." Why would anyone choose to forget kindness? Because remembering means acknowledging that you once needed help. Some people find that easier to forget than to carry. Her voice held gentle wisdom earned over decades of watching human nature play out in a small town. But that doesn't make the kindness any less real or any less important. Darren gathered the folder and the directory. Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton. This helps more than you know. Will you tell me what you find? Yes, ma'am, I will. As he climbed the stairs back to the main floor, Darren's mind was already racing ahead. The community reserve, a quarter-mile into the woods, somewhere his father and others had met to coordinate their quiet acts of generosity. Outside, Rook greeted him with his usual enthusiasm, tail wagging as if they'd been separated for days rather than an hour. Darren untied the leash, and they started back toward the creek. But his route had changed. He wasn't going home, not yet. He was going to find that reserve. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees as they left the main path and pushed deeper into the woods. Darren carried the maps, checking them frequently, trying to orient himself by landmarks that might or might not still exist after 70 years. Rook seemed to sense the purpose in their wandering. The dog ranged ahead, nose to the ground, occasionally looking back to make sure Darren was following. It reminded Darren of yesterday, when Rook had found the buried box. The dog had instincts that sometimes seemed uncanny. An hour passed. The woods grew thicker, older. These were trees that had stood for generations, and beneath their canopy the light turned green and golden. Darren was about to stop and reconsider his bearings when Rook suddenly froze, his whole body alert. "What is it, boy?" The dog moved forward slowly, deliberately, toward a dense thicket of undergrowth. Darren followed, pushing through brambles and vines that caught at his clothes. And then he saw it, barely visible beneath decades of growth, a low stone wall. Darren spent the rest of that afternoon clearing away the undergrowth around the stone wall. It was slow work, his hands soon scratched and bleeding from thorns, but he kept at it with a determination that surprised him. Rook helped in his own way, digging at the base of the wall and uncovering what looked like foundation stones. By the time the sun began to set, Darren had exposed a rectangular foundation about 20 feet by 15. There was no building anymore, if there ever had been one. Just these weathered stones, marking the outline of something that had once stood here. In the center, partially buried, was what appeared to be an old well, its opening covered by a rotted wooden cap. He tried the key in the well's rusted padlock, but it didn't fit. Whatever this place had been, the key wasn't meant for it. Disappointed, but not defeated, Darren marked the location in his mind and headed back to the shack as darkness gathered. That night, he studied the maps by lamplight, circling the remaining locations Garrison had mentioned. The mill would be dangerous to explore. The building was condemned, its floors rotted through in places. But the church storage building seemed promising, and it would be easier to access. Morning came, with a light rain that softened everything, and made the world smell of earth and growing things. Darren waited until the rain stopped, then set out for town again with Rook at his side. The church was on the east end of Main Street, a white clapboard building with a modest steeple. Behind it, connected by a covered walkway, stood the storage building, a simple structure that had been added sometime after the church itself was built. The church office was open. Darren knocked and entered to find a man in his 60s organizing papers at a desk. He wore casual clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt, and had the kind face of someone who'd spent years listening to other people's troubles. "Can I help you?" the man asked, looking up with genuine interest rather than suspicion. "I'm looking for Mr. Vaughan, the caretaker. You found him. And you are?" Darren Pritchard. "I was wondering if I might look through the storage building. I'm researching some local history." Vaughan studied him for a moment, and Darren braced for the usual recognition followed by dismissal. But instead, the man simply nodded. "What kind of history?" "My father was involved in community work here in the 50s and 60s. I'm trying to learn more about what he did." "Lawrence Pritchard was your father?" Vaughan's expression brightened. "He was before my time, but I've heard the stories. Good man, from what people said. Come on, I'll show you the storage building. They walked across the wet grass to the smaller building. Vaughn unlocked the door and pushed it open, revealing a space crowded with the accumulated debris of decades, old pews, broken hymnals, boxes of records, furniture in various states of disrepair. Most of this should probably be thrown out, Vaughn admitted. But churches hang on to things. You never know when someone might want to look back at the past. Do you have records from the 1950s? Somewhere in here, yes. The older files are in the back. Help yourself, just be careful. Some of those boxes haven't been moved in years. Darren spent the next 2 hours methodically searching through dusty boxes, while Rook waited outside in the shade. He found old bulletins, financial records, lists of baptisms and weddings and funerals. The everyday accounting of a church's life, important to someone once. Now just paper memories. In the third box from the back wall, he found something different. A ledger bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed but still readable. The entries dated from 1951 to 1959, and they recorded donations to something called the Community Assistance Fund. The amounts varied. $10 here, $20 there, sometimes as much as $50. The contributors were listed only as anonymous friend, or by initials that meant nothing to Darren. But the recipients were named. Families who'd received help with rent, medical bills, school supplies, winter heating costs. Darren recognized some of the surnames. The Hawthorns, their grandson, ran the hardware store now. The Bishops, their daughter was on the town council. The Keatings, Mrs. Keating, who served him so reluctantly at the general store. These were the families who'd been helped. These were the people whose ancestors had received kindness when they desperately needed it. And most of them, Darren suspected, had no idea, finding anything interesting. Vaughn asked from the doorway. Darren looked up. This ledger, the Community Assistance Fund. Do you know anything about it? Vaughn came closer and looked at the book. I've heard references to it. Before my time, like I said, but the old-timers used to mention it. There was a group of men who pooled their money to help people during hard times. Very quiet about it. Didn't want any recognition. My father was part of that group. That would make sense from what I know of him. Vaughn pulled up an old chair and sat down. You know, there was something else. I heard about it from Reverend Sterling. He's retired now, lives over in Glendale. He was the minister here in the 60s and 70s. He told me once that the group had a sort of charter, a written agreement about how they'd operate and what they'd do with any property they acquired. Property? Land, I think. They bought some land together, planned to use it for community purposes. But I don't know what happened to it. Vaughn gestured at the ledger. You're welcome to take that if it helps your research. Nobody here knows what half this stuff is anymore. Are you sure? I'm sure. And Darren, Vaughn's voice softened, I'm sorry for the way some people in this town have treated you. It's not right. A man's circumstances shouldn't determine his worth. The unexpected kindness hit Darren harder than any insult ever had. He had to look away, blinking against the sudden heat in his eyes. Thank you, he managed. He left the church with the ledger tucked under his arm, his mind spinning with new information. The key still hadn't found its lock, but the pieces were starting to come together. His father and others had created a fund to help people. They'd kept careful records, and they'd bought land, possibly the same land where he'd found the stone foundation, but none of this explained the key itself. What did it open? Back at the shack, Darren spread everything out on his makeshift table, the maps, the ledger, the key. He made notes on scraps of paper, trying to create a timeline, a pattern, some logical connection between all these fragments of history. Rook lay nearby, watching him work with patient interest. The dog had been unusually attentive since they'd found the key, as if he understood that something significant was happening. As evening fell, Darren lit his lamp and continued studying. The ledger showed regular donations through 1959. Then the entries became sporadic, finally stopping altogether in 1962. Around the same time, according to Mrs. Pemberton, the community reserve had disappeared from town maps. What had happened? Had the group simply disbanded? Or had something else occurred? Something that caused them to close up their operation and hide their records? The key felt heavier in his hand now, weighted with questions. Somewhere in this town, there was a lock that matched it. Somewhere, his father had secured something he wanted kept safe. Darren was going to find it. Not just because he needed to know, but because in searching for his father's secrets, he'd stumbled onto something unexpected, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since his life had fallen apart, Darren had a reason to keep going. 3 days passed before Darren could arrange access to the old town hall basement. Mrs. Pemberton had made the necessary calls, pulling strings with people who owed her favors, accumulated over decades of quiet assistance. The current town offices were in a newer building on the other side of Main Street, but the basement of the original structure remained, sealed and largely forgotten beneath what was now a small public park. Darren met Mrs. Pemberton at the park entrance on a grey Thursday morning. She carried a ring of old keys and a flashlight, looking determined despite her years. "The entrance is around back," she said. "The town council hasn't been down there in at least a decade. They keep saying they'll clean it out, but nobody ever does." They walked through the park to a concrete structure that looked like it might once have been a storm shelter. Mrs. Pemberton tried several keys before one finally turned in the rusted lock. The door opened with a groan of protest, revealing stairs descending into darkness. "I'll wait here with Rook," she said, handing Darren the flashlight. "Be careful. Those stairs are old." Darren tested each step before putting his weight on it. The air grew cooler and damper as he descended, carrying the smell of mildew and undisturbed time. At the bottom, his flashlight beam revealed a long corridor with rooms branching off on either side. The space was larger than he'd expected. Clearly, this had been a proper town hall once, with offices and storage and probably a meeting room. Now it was a repository for things nobody knew what to do with: old filing cabinets, broken furniture, boxes of papers that had likely been important to someone. Once Darren moved methodically through the rooms, searching for anything that might match the key. He tried it on filing cabinets and old trunks, on locked drawers in damaged desks. Nothing fit. His initial excitement began to fade into frustration. The last room at the end of the corridor was the largest. It had probably been the main meeting space. Long tables were pushed against the walls, chairs stacked haphazardly. Boxes and crates filled most of the floor space. In the far corner, almost hidden behind a stack of old record books, Darren spotted a desk, heavy, dark wood. The kind of furniture they'd made to last generations. He approached it carefully, moving boxes out of his way. The desk had 3 drawers on each side and one in the center. 5 of them opened easily, revealing nothing but dust and the occasional paperclip. But the bottom right drawer was locked. Darren pulled out the key. His hand was shaking slightly as he inserted it into the lock. For a moment it stuck, and he thought once again he'd been wrong. Then something shifted, and he felt the mechanism give way. The drawer opened. Inside was a single item, a sealed manila envelope, yellowed with age but intact. Written on the front in careful script were the words, "For the keeper, to be opened only in time of need." Darren's heart hammered in his chest. This was it. This was what his father had locked away, what the key had been meant to protect. He lifted the envelope carefully, surprised by its weight. There was something substantial inside. He carried it back through the corridor and up the stairs into daylight. Mrs. Pemberton looked up expectantly as he emerged. "You found something," she said, reading his expression. "An envelope, sealed. It says it's for the keeper. Are you going to open it?" Darren looked down at the envelope in his hands. Part of him wanted to tear it open immediately, to finally know what his father had considered important enough to hide and protect. But another part, the part that had been raised to respect boundaries and honor intentions, hesitated. "Not here," he said finally. "Not yet. I want to think about this." They walked back to the library together, Mrs. Pemberton respecting his silence. At the entrance she paused. "Darren, whatever's in that envelope, it was meant for someone. Maybe that someone is you." "Maybe," he agreed. "Or maybe I'm just the person who happened to find it. I don't believe in coincidences like that," she said gently. not when it comes to fathers and sons. Back at the shack, Darren placed the envelope on his table and simply stared at it. Rook sat beside him, patient as always, seeming to understand that this was a moment that required contemplation. The light faded outside. Darren lit his lamp and made himself a simple dinner of rice and canned beans. He ate mechanically, his eyes constantly drawn back to the envelope. Finally, as full darkness settled over the creek, he made his decision. He opened it. Inside were several items. First, a letter written in his father's familiar hand. Second, a series of photographs showing a gathering of men standing in a clearing, the same clearing where Darren had found the stone foundation. Third, a document that appeared to be some kind of legal agreement. And fourth, a folded piece of paper that, when opened, revealed a hand-drawn map. Darren read the letter first, his father's words reaching across the years. "To whoever finds this, I hope you are someone who understands the value of what we built here. In 1947, after returning from a war that showed us the worst of what humans could do, a group of us decided we wanted to build something that showed the best. We pooled our limited resources and created a fund to help our neighbors in times of need. We did this not for recognition or reward, but because it was right. Over the years, we helped more than 40 families. We paid rent when jobs were lost. We covered medical costs when illness struck. We made sure children had what they needed for school. We did this quietly because pride is a real thing, and people deserve their dignity. In 1952, we purchased a piece of land near the creek. Our intention was to develop it as a community resource, a place where people could gather, where the town could come together in times of crisis, where anyone who needed help could find it. We restored an old well for emergency water. We built a small shelter. We planted fruit trees, but life intervened, as it does. People moved away. Others passed on. The need for our fund decreased as the economy improved. By 1962, only 3 of us remained active, and we made the decision to put everything in trust. This land and a small remaining fund were to be held for the future, for a time when they might be needed again. The document in this envelope is the deed of trust. Due to circumstances I won't detail here, it was never properly recorded. That oversight was my responsibility, and I regret it, but the land remains, and the intention remains, and I hope that whoever finds this will see fit to preserve what we built. To my son Darren, if you are reading this, I know I was not the father you deserved. I worked too much, said too little, and left you with more questions than answers. But know that I tried to live a life of meaning, and I hope you will too. The true measure of a man is not in what he accumulates, but in what he gives away. With hope for the future, Lawrence Pritchard, September 1963. Darren read the letter 3 times, his vision blurring with tears he didn't try to hide. His father had written this when Darren was only 3 years old, long before their relationship would become distant, before all the missed opportunities for connection. He studied the photographs next. His father was there, younger than Darren remembered him ever being, standing with 6 other men. They looked tired, but hopeful, the way men do when they're building something they believe in. The trust document was complex, full of legal language Darren only partly understood. But the essential meaning was clear. The land was to be held in perpetuity for community benefit, managed by a designated keeper who would ensure it remained accessible to those in need. The map showed the exact location of the property, 23 acres along Willow Creek, including the clearing with the foundation and the restored well. 23 acres that technically belonged to no one because the trust had never been recorded. 23 acres that developers or the county or anyone with legal knowledge could potentially claim. 23 acres that represented his father's legacy and the quiet generosity of men who'd asked for nothing in return. Darren looked at Rook, who was watching him with those intelligent eyes. "What do I do, boy?" he asked quietly. But he already knew the answer. His father had written that letter hoping someone would find it and understand. Someone who would preserve what they'd built. Someone who would become the keeper. That someone was him. Morning came with birdsong and the sound of the creek running high from recent rain. Darren woke early, his father's letter still on the table where he'd left it the night before. He read it again over coffee, finding new meaning in words he'd already memorized. The hand-drawn map showed details the modern maps had missed. The exact boundaries of the property, marked trees that might still be standing. The location of what his father had called marker stones placed at the corners. If Darren could find these markers, he could prove the land's extent and document its intended purpose. He gathered supplies, the map, his father's old compass he'd retrieved from storage, a notebook, water, and some rope in case he needed to mark his findings. Rook sensed the purposefulness in his movements and was already waiting by the door, tail wagging. They set out into the woods, following the creek upstream. The morning sun filtered through the canopy, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow. Darren checked the map frequently, comparing his father's landmarks to what he could see around him. The first marker stone was exactly where the map indicated. A flat rock about 2 feet across, with CP 1952 carved into its surface. Community property, Darren realized. His father and the others had literally set the boundaries of their shared dream in stone. From there, the trail led deeper into the woods. Rook ranged ahead, occasionally stopping to sniff at something interesting, or to look back and make sure Darren was following. The dog seemed to understand the path without needing the map, as if some instinct was guiding him. The second marker took longer to find. The forest had changed in 70 years. Trees had fallen, new growth had filled in clearings, and the landscape his father had known was buried under decades of natural transformation. But the stone was there, hidden under a carpet of moss and fallen leaves. Darren cleared it carefully and made notes of its location. As he worked, he heard voices in the distance. He froze, listening. 2 men, maybe 3, somewhere to his left. They were moving through the woods, their conversation carrying on the still air. Umber said this whole section is county land, nobody's using it. Perfect for what we're planning. Close enough to town, but private, if we can get the permits approved. Darren moved quietly behind a large oak, motioning for Rook to stay silent. Through the trees, he could see 2 men in business casual clothes, clearly out of their element in the woods. One was consulting something on his phone, probably a GPS or property map. They were surveying the land, the same land his father had purchased and placed in trust. The same land that, because of one man's oversight 60 years ago, appeared unclaimed on modern records. The men moved on, their voices fading. Darren waited until he was certain they were gone before continuing his search. But the encounter had added urgency to his mission. Whatever he was going to do to protect this land, he needed to do it soon. The third marker stone sat near the restored well in the clearing. Finding it felt like closing a circle. This was where his journey had truly begun, when Rook had started digging and uncovered the metal box containing the key. Now Darren understood that even that discovery hadn't been random. The box had been buried near the property's center, almost as if his father had known that someday someone would need to find it. The fourth and final marker took him to the far edge of the property, where the land sloped down toward a small ravine. This stone was larger than the others and bore not just the date but also initials, the founding members of the group. His father's initials were there. L.P. Darren traced them with his finger, feeling the carved grooves his father's hands or hired hands had made decades before he was born. This had mattered to his father. This piece of land, this vision of community support, had been important enough to mark permanently in stone. He sat down on the marker, suddenly exhausted by more than just the morning's hike. The weight of what he'd discovered pressed down on him. His father had created something meaningful, something that had helped real people in real need. And then it had been forgotten, allowed to slip away into bureaucratic obscurity, but not completely forgotten. His father had made sure of that. He'd hidden the evidence, locked it away with a key, and trusted that someday someone would care enough to look. Rook came and sat beside him. leaning his weight against Darren's leg, in that way dogs have of offering comfort without words. Darren scratched behind the dog's ears and looked out over the land his father had helped preserve. The afternoon sun was slanting through the trees when Darren finally made his way back to the shack. He documented all 4 markers, measured distances as best he could, and created a rough survey of the property. It wasn't professional work, but it was a start. Back home, he spread everything out on his table: the trust document, the photographs, the map, his notes from the day's exploration. He needed help. He needed someone who understood property law and could tell him what options he had. He needed someone who could help him make the trust official, who could ensure this land stayed protected. But who? He had no money for lawyers, he barely had money for food, and he was still the town's drifter, the man people avoided or mocked. Who would take him seriously? Mrs. Pemberton. The name came to him with quiet certainty. If anyone would know how to help, it would be her. She'd been the one to give him access to the records, the one who'd helped him research, the one who'd treated him with consistent respect. Tomorrow, he'd go back to the library and ask for her guidance. That evening, as darkness settled over the creek, Darren sat outside with Rook and watched the stars emerge. For the first time in years, he felt connected to something larger than his own failures. His father had planted seeds decades ago, and now, improbably, impossibly, those seeds had sprouted in the hands of his broken-down son. The irony wasn't lost on him. The town's most scorned resident, living in poverty by the creek, had become the keeper of land meant to help people in need. He was exactly the kind of person his father's organization would have assisted. Maybe that was the point. Maybe his father had known, or at least hoped, that understanding what it meant to need help would make someone a better keeper of resources. Meant for others. Darren pulled out the letter and read it one more time by lamplight. The true measure of a man is not in what he accumulates, but in what he gives away. He had nothing to give but his effort, his determination, and his word that he would protect what his father had built. It would have to be enough. Rook's ears suddenly perked up, and a moment later Darren heard it too. A vehicle on the road, slowing down near the path that led to his shack. Headlights swept through the trees, then went dark. A car door opened and closed. Footsteps approached through the darkness. Darren stood, his heart racing. Rook moved to his side, not growling but alert, protective. Few people came to his shack, and none after dark. The footsteps came closer, and then a figure emerged into the circle of lamplight. It was a woman, maybe 40, dressed in jeans and a practical jacket. She carried a briefcase and had the confident bearing of someone used to being taken seriously. Darren Pritchard. She asked, "Yes, who are you?" "My name is Sandra Cross. I'm an attorney with the County Legal Aid Office." She paused, studying him in the lamplight. "Mrs. Pemberton called me this afternoon. She said you might need help with a property matter." Darren felt something loosen in his chest, relief so profound it was almost painful. "She did. She did. And from what she told me, what you've uncovered is quite significant." Sandra gestured to his makeshift table. "May I see what you found?" Sandra Cross spent over an hour examining every document Darren had found. She read his father's letter twice, studied the trust deed with a lawyer's careful eye, and made notes in a leather-bound notebook she pulled from her briefcase. Darren watched her work, afraid to hope but unable to stop himself. Finally she looked up. "This is legitimate," she said. The trust was properly drawn up, signed by all parties, and notarized. The only problem is that it was never filed with the county recorder's office. What does that mean? It means the land is in legal limbo. The trust exists, these documents prove it, but it has no official standing. As far as county records show, this property was never transferred to the trust, which means it still appears to be owned by the original seller. And that seller has been dead for 40 years. Darren's hope began to sink. "So it's worthless?" "I didn't say that." Sandra tapped the trust document. "This can still be filed. It's late, very late, but there's legal precedent for accepting delayed filings when proper documentation exists. We'd need to petition the court, provide evidence of the original intent, and demonstrate that the land has been maintained according to the trust's purposes. Can you help me do that? That's why I'm here. Legal aid exists for situations exactly like this, people who need legal help but can't afford private attorneys. She smiled slightly. Though I have to say, this is the most interesting case I've had in years. Over the next hour, Sandra explained what would need to happen. They'd have to file a petition with the county court to recognize the trust retroactively. They'd need to find surviving witnesses or descendants who could testify to the group's intentions. They'd have to demonstrate that the land had been used for community purposes, or at least preserved for that use. The biggest challenge, Sandra said, is that there may be competing claims. If developers have already filed paperwork to claim abandoned property, we'll be in a race to establish legal standing first. The men I saw in the woods today, Darren said. They were surveying. They talked about permits. Sandra's expression grew serious. Then we need to move quickly. I'll start the paperwork tomorrow. In the meantime, I need you to find anyone who might remember your father's organization. Anyone who was helped by them or who knew about the land purchase. After Sandra left, Darren lay on his cot but couldn't sleep. His mind churned with possibilities and fears. He'd gone from having nothing to lose to suddenly having everything at stake. If he succeeded, he'd preserve his father's legacy. If he failed, this land would be lost forever, and with it any chance of redemption. The next morning he returned to the library. Mrs. Pemberton greeted him with cautious optimism. "Sandra called me last night. She thinks you have a real chance. She said I need to find people who remember. People my father helped." Mrs. Pemberton nodded slowly. "I may know someone. Horace Brennan. He's 91 now, lives over at Meadowview Assisted Living. He used to talk about hard times in the 50s and how someone helped him keep his farm. Do you think he'd speak with me? Let me call him first. Set it up properly." That afternoon, Darren found himself in the tidy living room of Horace Brennan's apartment at Meadowview. The old man was small and weathered, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but his eyes were sharp and clear. "Lawrence Pritchard's boy," Horace said when Mrs. Pemberton introduced them. "You look like him around the eyes." They sat, and Darren explained what he'd found. As he talked, Horace's expression shifted from polite interest to something deeper, recognition and memory and old emotion rising to the surface. "That land," Horace said quietly. "I remember when they bought it. Summer of 52. I was there for the first gathering." "You were part of the group?" No. I was one of the people they helped." Horace's voice grew thick. "I'd just come back from Korea, bought a small farm with my discharge pay, but the first year the crops failed and I was going to lose everything. I had a wife, a baby daughter. I didn't know what to do." He paused, his hands trembling slightly. "One day I got a letter. Just said that an anonymous friend had paid my mortgage for 6 months to give me time to get on my feet. No name, no return address. Just help when I needed it most. It was my father's group," Darren said. "I know that now. Took me years to figure it out, piecing together conversations, noticing things. Your father and a few others, they saved my life. Not just my farm, my actual life. I was at the end of my rope." Horace looked directly at Darren. "Why are you here, son?" Darren explained about the trust, the legal limbo, the developers circling. "I need people who can testify that the land was meant for community use. That my father and the others had a legitimate purpose." "I'll testify," Horace said immediately. "I owe your father that and more. But son, there's something you should know. Something I never told anyone." He stood with difficulty and retrieved a shoebox from his closet. Inside were old letters, photographs, and a small leather journal. Horace pulled out the journal and handed it to Darren. "This belonged to your father. He gave it to me in 1960, asked me to keep it safe. Said if anything happened to him, someone might need it someday." Darren opened the journal with shaking hands. Inside were names, dozens of them, with dates and brief descriptions of help provided. But there was more. On the last few pages, his father had written about the land itself. June 1959. Discovered the old settlement foundation. The land has history. Native American gathering place, later a stop on the Underground Railroad. The well was dug in 1847 by freedmen passing through. This ground has always been about sanctuary, about helping people in need. We didn't just buy land, we became stewards of something sacred. Darren read further, his heart pounding. His father had documented finding artifacts, arrowheads, old coins, remnants of structures that suggested the land had been used for generations as a place of refuge. But then the final entry, September 1963. Someone is pressuring me to sell the land. Won't say who. Offered significant money. Refused, of course, but concerned about safety of the trust documents. Have hidden the deed and key separately. If they can't prove ownership, they can't force a sale. The land must remain protected. Darren looked up at Horace. Someone tried to buy the land from him? More than tried. After your father refused, there were threats. Nothing direct, but his truck was vandalized, his house broken into. Nothing taken, just a message. He was scared, though he never showed it. That's why he split up the documents, the deed in one place, the key in another. He was protecting the trust the only way he knew how. Who was pressuring him? He never said, but about a month after he hid everything, he died. Heart attack in his sleep, they said. Horace's voice dropped. Always seemed convenient timing to me. The implication hung in the air. Darren felt cold despite the warm room. You think someone killed him? I think your father was a healthy man who suddenly died after refusing to sell valuable land. I think the deed was never filed because he was afraid of what might happen if certain people knew it existed. And I think, Horace leaned forward, that whoever wanted that land back then probably has descendants who want it now. Darren thought about the men in suits surveying the woods, about the development company that Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned, about how quickly they'd moved once he started asking questions. The people he helped, Darren said slowly. Some of them became successful, built businesses, raised families who are now leaders in town. That's right. And they've forgotten, or they never knew. But what if some of them did know? What if someone learned about the trust and didn't want it exposed because it would reveal their family's past poverty? Horace nodded grimly. Shame's a powerful motivator. So is greed. That land's worth a lot now, sitting right near town. Worth enough to make people do things they shouldn't. Darren stood, the journal clutched in his hands. This wasn't just about preserving his father's legacy anymore. This was about uncovering a truth that someone had worked very hard to keep buried for 60 years, and that someone probably knew he was getting close. Darren left Meadowview with his father's journal and a growing sense of urgency. If Horace was right, if his father's death hadn't been natural, then whoever had wanted the land 60 years ago might still want it today. And they'd already proven willing to use intimidation, if not worse. He called Sandra Cross from a payphone outside the grocery store. She answered on the second ring. I found something, Darren said. My father's journal, and a witness who says my father was threatened before he died. There was a pause. Where are you? Main Street, the payphone by Ferguson's Market. Stay there. I'm coming to you. 20 minutes later, Sandra arrived with Mrs. Pemberton. They sat in Sandra's car while Darren showed them the journal and recounted everything Horace had told him. Sandra read through the entries, her expression growing more serious with each page. This changes things, she said finally. If your father was coerced or threatened, and if he hid the documents specifically to prevent illegal seizure of the trust property, that strengthens our case considerably. But it also means we're up against someone with resources and willingness to play dirty, Mrs. Pemberton added quietly. Who would benefit from claiming this land now? Sandra asked. Darren had been thinking about this all morning. Developers, obviously, but also anyone who wants to prevent the truth about the trust from coming out. Anyone whose family was helped back then and doesn't want that known. That could be half the town, Mrs. Pemberton said. The Hawthorns, the Bishops, the Keatings, all. Those families in the ledger are still here, still prominent. Sandra tapped her pen against the journal. We need to move faster than I planned. I'm going to file the petition first thing tomorrow morning, but we also need more witnesses. Horace is good, but one 91-year-old man won't be enough if we're challenged. There were two other people mentioned in the letter, Darren said. Mrs. Yates and Reverend Sterling. Mrs. Pemberton nodded. Beverly Yates lives on Oak Street. She's 86. And Reverend Sterling retired to Glendale, about 30 miles from here. Can you contact them? Sandra asked. We need their statements as soon as possible. Over the next 3 days, Darren became a man with a mission. Mrs. Pemberton arranged the meetings, and together they visited Beverly Yates, a sharp-minded woman who remembered the trust vividly and still had letters of gratitude her family had written to the anonymous donors. They kept our family fed through 2 winters, Beverly said, her voice steady despite tears in her eyes. My father was too proud to ask for help, but somehow these men knew we needed it. They saved us. Reverend Sterling proved harder to reach. He was recovering from a fall and couldn't travel, but he agreed to a phone interview with Sandra, giving a sworn statement about blessing the original gathering on the land and witnessing the signing of the trust agreement. That land was sacred. Space, Sterling told them over speakerphone, his elderly voice firm with conviction. Not religious sacred, but human sacred, a place set aside for kindness. Your father understood that, Darren. He understood what really mattered. While Sandra compiled statements and prepared legal documents, Darren returned to the property each day, documenting everything. He photographed the marker stones, measured the boundaries more carefully, and explored every inch of the 23 acres. He found remnants of the fruit trees his father's letter had mentioned, old apple trees, gnarled and mostly dead, but still standing as testimony to long-ago intentions. He also found evidence that someone else had been there recently, surveyor's stakes marked with bright orange tape, fresh tire tracks on an old logging road that skirted the property's edge, the sense of being watched that made the hair on his neck stand up. On the 4th day, Darren returned to his shack to find it had been vandalized. The door hung open, his few possessions scattered. Someone had torn through everything, clearly searching for something. The trust documents, he'd given those to Sandra. His father's letter, in Sandra's office safe. The journal locked in Mrs. Pemberton's library desk. But they'd left a message, spray-painted across his table in red letters. Leave the past buried. Rook had been with Darren, thank goodness, but the violation made his hands shake with anger and fear. He called Sandra immediately. Pack what you need, she said. You're not staying there tonight. I have a guest room. We're not taking chances. That evening, sitting in Sandra's comfortable home with Rook at his feet, Darren learned that the petition would be heard by the county court in 3 days. Sandra had rushed the filing, citing the immediate threat to the property and the historical significance of the trust. The judge is Martin Thatcher, Sandra said. He's fair, but he's also particular about proper documentation and legal procedure. We'll need to present a compelling case. What are our chances? Honestly, 50-50. We have the documents, we have witnesses, we have your father's clear intent. But the other side, and there will be another side, will argue that a 60-year-old unfiled trust shouldn't suddenly be recognized. They'll say it's too late, that the land has been functionally abandoned, that modern development serves the community better than preserving empty woods. But my father created this for a reason. I know, and we're going to make that case. But Darren, you need to be prepared. Even if we win recognition of the trust, there will be challenges. People will question why you should be the keeper. They'll point to your circumstances, suggest you're not capable of managing community property. The words stung because they echoed his own doubts. Maybe they're right. Or maybe, Sandra said gently, you're exactly the right person. Someone who understands what it means to need help. Someone who won't forget why this land matters. The next 2 days were a blur of preparation. Sandra coached Darren on what to expect in court, how to answer questions, how to present himself. Mrs. Pemberton helped him find clean clothes that fit properly. Donations from the church, but good quality and dignified. Horace, Beverly, and Reverend Sterling all confirmed they would testify or provide statements. The case was as strong as they could make it. On the evening before the hearing, Darren sat in Sandra's backyard with Rook, watching the sunset. He thought about his father, standing in those same woods decades ago, believing that kindness mattered more than profit, believing that some things were worth protecting even when no one was watching. Tomorrow, Darren would stand in front of a judge and fight for that belief. He would speak for his father and for all the people who'd been helped in secret. He would try to preserve something good in a world that often seemed to reward only the ruthless. He didn't know if he would win, but he knew he had to try. The county courthouse was a solid brick building that had witnessed decades of small-town justice. Darren arrived early with Sandra, his hands clammy despite the cool morning air. He wore the donated suit that Mrs. Pemberton had found, slightly too large in the shoulders, but clean and respectable. The courtroom was smaller than he'd expected, with wooden benches and tall windows that let in morning light. Judge Martin Thatcher sat behind an elevated desk, a man in his 60s with steel-grey hair and the patient expression of someone who'd heard every kind of story. Darren took his seat at the petitioner's table with Sandra. He glanced back and saw friendly faces: Mrs. Pemberton, Horace in a wheelchair pushed by a nurse, Beverly Yates with her daughter. Reverend Sterling had sent a notarized statement given his health, but there were others too. On the opposite side of the room sat 3 men in expensive suits. One was the attorney for Millstream Development Corporation, a firm Darren had never heard of until yesterday when Sandra received their opposition filing. The other 2 were principals of the company. One of them was Stuart Hawthorne, owner of the hardware store and grandson of a family the trust had helped. He wouldn't meet Darren's eyes. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Thatcher reviewed the papers before him, then looked up at Sandra. "Ms. Cross, you filed an unusual petition, a trust that's 60 years old, never recorded, and now you want the court to recognize it retroactively. That's quite a request," Sandra stood. "Yes, Your Honor, but we have documentation showing clear intent, proper legal formation, and witnesses who can testify to the trust's legitimate purpose and operation. I've reviewed your evidence. I'll hear your case, but I want to be clear. The burden of proof is substantial here." He turned to the opposing attorney. "Mr. Whitmore, you're representing Millstream Development Corporation." "Yes, Your Honor. We'll be arguing that this alleged trust has no legal standing and that our client has properly filed a claim for the abandoned property in question." The hearing began with Sandra presenting the trust documents. She walked the judge through each piece: the original agreement, the signatures, the notarization, the letter from Darren's father explaining why it hadn't been filed. "Your Honor, Lawrence Pritchard was threatened because of this land. He hid these documents to protect the trust from illegal seizure. His death shortly afterward ended any chance of proper filing, until now, when his son discovered what his father had preserved." Whitmore stood. "Objection, Your Honor. Ms. Cross is speculating about threats with no evidence beyond hearsay and a self-serving letter." "Sustained," Judge Thatcher said. "Stick to what you can prove, Ms. Cross." Sandra nodded and moved on, calling Horace to testify. The old man wheeled forward, and despite his age, his voice was strong. "I was there when they bought that land," Horace said. "Summer of 1952. Lawrence Pritchard and 6 other men pooled their money to create something for the community. They helped my family when we had nothing. They helped dozens of families asking nothing in return. And the land?" Sandra prompted. "They restored an old well, built a shelter, planted fruit trees. It was meant to be a place where people could gather, where help would always be available. That was the whole point of the trust." Whitmore cross-examined carefully. "Mr. Brennan, you're 91 years old. How clearly do you remember events from 70 years ago?" "I remember the important things," Horace said firmly. "I remember kindness when I needed it most. That kind of thing stays with you." Beverly Yates testified next, her statement reinforcing Horace's. She brought the old letters her family had written, thanking anonymous benefactors for help during their darkest times. "This wasn't charity for charity's sake," Beverly said. "It was neighbors taking care of neighbors. That land represented their commitment to that principle." The morning wore on. Sandra presented the photographs, the marker stones, the journal entries documenting the land's history and use. She built a careful case, piece by piece, showing intent and purpose and legitimate creation of the trust. Then Whitmore stood for the defense. Your Honor, this is a touching story about the past. But it's also a story about a trust that was never properly executed. The law requires filing for a reason, to prevent exactly this kind of situation, where decades later, someone can claim ownership of valuable property based on old papers. He gestured to Darren. The petitioner is asking this court to award him control of 23 acres of prime real estate based on documents his father never bothered to file legally. Documents that conveniently surfaced only after my client began the proper legal process to claim abandoned land. Sandra shot to her feet. The documents didn't conveniently surface. They were deliberately hidden to protect them from theft or destruction. And the petitioner isn't claiming ownership. The trust would maintain ownership for community benefit, with Mr. Pritchard serving as steward, exactly as his father intended. Judge Thatcher held up a hand. I understand both positions. Ms. Cross, do you have anything else? One more witness, Your Honor, the petitioner himself. Darren's heart hammered as Sandra called him forward. He took the witness stand, his mouth dry, very aware of everyone's eyes on him. Sandra's questions were gentle, designed to let him tell his story. He explained finding the key, searching for what it opened, discovering his father's letter. He talked about the marker stones, the old well, the evidence of his father's careful stewardship. Then Whitmore stood for cross-examination, and his tone was anything but gentle. Mr. Pritchard, you're currently unemployed, correct? Yes. Living in an illegal structure by the creek? Darren felt heat rise to his face. Yes. How exactly do you plan to serve as steward of valuable community property when you can't even maintain your own basic living situation? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Darren felt every eye in the courtroom on him, measuring his worth, finding him wanting. This was the moment he dreaded, being judged not for his intentions, but for his circumstances. He took a breath and met Whitmore's eyes directly. You're right, he said quietly. I don't have much. I lost my job, my marriage, nearly everything I owned. For 3 years I've lived by that creek in a shack that's barely standing. I've been the person this town looks down on, the one people cross the street to avoid. Whitmore smiled slightly, thinking he'd won the point. But that's exactly why I understand what my father was trying to do, Darren continued, his voice growing stronger. I know what it means to need help. I know what it feels like when people forget you exist, when you become invisible because you're poor or struggling. My father and his friends created this trust because they understood that anyone can fall, and everyone deserves a hand up when they do. He looked at Judge Thatcher now. I'm not asking to own this land. I'm asking for the chance to protect it the way my father intended, as a resource for people who need it. And yes, maybe I'm not the steward anyone would choose if they were looking at qualifications on paper. But I'm the one who cared enough to dig up the truth. I'm the one who won't forget what this land represents. The courtroom was silent. Even Whitmore seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Sandra stood. Your Honor, I'd like to present one final piece of evidence. She approached with a document. This is a current appraisal of the property. It's worth approximately $370,000 at market value. She turned to face Darren. Mr. Pritchard, if this court denies the trust and the land goes to auction, you could file a claim as your father's heir. You might be able to purchase it or at least profit from the sale. You'd no longer be poor. Is that what you want? Darren understood what she was doing, giving him the chance to show his true motivations. No, he said firmly. That's not what my father wanted. The money doesn't matter. Keeping the trust intact matters. Whitmore stood again. Your Honor, we haven't established that Mr. Pritchard is even his father's legal heir, and this entire discussion is premature. The fundamental question remains, should a decades-old, unfiled document override proper legal procedures being followed today? The proper procedures, Sandra countered, are being used to claim land that was already designated for public benefit. Millstream Development wants this property because it's valuable, not because they care about the community. That's not true. Stuart Hawthorne stood suddenly from the gallery. Your Honor, may I speak? Judge Thatcher frowned. This is irregular, but go ahead. Hawthorne came forward, looking uncomfortable. I'm one of the principals in Millstream Development. And yes, we want to develop this land. But I also need to say something. He glanced at Darren. My grandfather was helped by this trust in 1953. He was about to lose his business. Someone, I now know it was probably Lawrence Pritchard and his group, paid his debts anonymously. That gave my grandfather a second chance, and he built the hardware store that I run today. Then why are you trying to develop the land? Sandra asked. Because I didn't know, Hawthorne said, his voice tight. Not until this hearing, reading these documents, seeing the names. My grandfather never told us. He was too proud, I suppose. And now I've spent the last hour listening to testimony about kindness and community, realizing my whole business exists because of the very thing I'm trying to destroy. He turned to Judge Thatcher. I'm withdrawing our claim. Millstream Development will not contest the trust. Whitmore looked stricken. Mr. Hawthorne, we have a contractual agreement. We'll pay whatever penalties are necessary. But I won't fight this anymore. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Thatcher rapped his gavel. Order. Mr. Whitmore, does your client wish to continue without Mr. Hawthorne's company? Whitmore shuffled papers, clearly calculating his chances. Finally, he shook his head. No, Your Honor, we withdraw our opposition. Judge Thatcher leaned back in his chair, studying the documents before him. The room held its collective breath. This is an unusual case, he said finally. A trust created with good intentions, never properly filed, due to circumstances we can only partially reconstruct. Under normal circumstances, I would be inclined to deny this petition on procedural grounds alone. Darren felt his hope crumbling. However, the judge continued, the evidence presented shows clear intent, proper legal formation, and witnesses who confirm the trust was operational. More importantly, the land in question has been preserved according to the trust's stated purposes, even if unknowingly. And with no opposition, the legal complications are considerably reduced. He looked at Darren. Mr. Pritchard, I'm granting your petition. The trust is recognized retroactive to its creation in 1952. The land is hereby designated as community property under the terms outlined in the original trust document. You are appointed as steward, with oversight by the county to ensure proper management. The courtroom burst into applause. Mrs. Pemberton was crying. Horace raised a shaking fist in triumph. Sandra squeezed Darren's shoulder as he sat stunned, hardly able to believe what he'd heard. He'd won. The land was protected. His father's legacy was preserved. 3 months had passed since the courthouse hearing, and autumn had painted the woods in shades of amber and gold. Darren stood in the clearing where his father's vision had taken root decades ago, watching volunteers work to restore what time had obscured. The old well had been repaired and certified by the county. A local contractor, working at cost after hearing the story, had built a simple pavilion over the stone foundation. The fruit trees, though old, had been pruned and cared for by members of the garden club. The clearing was becoming what it had always been meant to be, a gathering place. Darren no longer lived in the shack by the creek. With the court's approval and a small stipend from the trust's restoration fund, he'd built a modest cabin on the property. Nothing fancy, but solid and weatherproof, with a real bed and a wood stove. He was the land's keeper now, officially and legally, responsible for maintaining it and ensuring it served its intended purpose. Rook lay in the shade of the pavilion, content and watchful as always. The dog had been with him through everything, and Darren couldn't imagine these changes without his faithful companion. Today was the dedication ceremony. Mrs. Pemberton had helped organize it, spreading word through the town and beyond. Darren had expected maybe 20 people. Instead, nearly 100 had shown up. There were the faces he knew, Mrs. Pemberton, Sandra Cross, Horace in his wheelchair, Beverly Yates with her extended family. Reverend Sterling had made the drive from Glendale, determined to see the land he'd blessed 60 years ago restored to its purpose. But there were others too. People whose families had been helped by the trust and wanted to honor that memory. Young families curious about the story that had captivated the town. Even Stuart Hawthorne stood at the back, looking both humble and relieved. At 2 o'clock, Darren stepped up to the small podium they'd set up. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Thank you all for coming. 3 months ago, I was living in a shack, considered a failure by most people who knew me. I'd lost almost everything, and I'd stopped believing I had anything left to offer the world." He paused, looking out at the gathered faces. "Then my dog dug up a box in the mud, and inside was a key. That key led me on a journey I never expected, one that taught me about my father, about this community's history, and about what really matters in life." He held up the golden key, now polished and gleaming. "This key didn't open a treasure chest. It opened something more valuable. A story about kindness, about people helping each other without expecting anything in return. My father and his friends created this trust because they understood something essential. We're all one bad break away from needing help, and we're all capable of offering it." Mrs. Pemberton stepped forward with a framed photograph, the one from his father's time capsule, showing the original members of the trust. Darren hung it on the pavilion's central post. These men weren't rich. They weren't powerful, but they made a difference because they chose to care. This land is their legacy, and now it's our responsibility. He gestured to the pavilion. "This space is open to anyone who needs it. Community gatherings, emergency shelter, a quiet place to think, whatever serves the greater good. The well provides water, the pavilion provides shelter, and the land provides something else. A reminder that we're all connected, all responsible for each other." Beverly Yates asked to speak. She approached slowly, leaning on her cane. "My family was saved by the generosity this trust represents. We never knew who helped us, but that kindness changed everything. I want to announce that I'm establishing a scholarship fund in honor of Lawrence Pritchard and his companions. It will help young people from struggling families attend college." Applause rippled through the crowd. Others stepped forward with their own commitments: volunteer hours, donations of materials, offers to help maintain the property. Stuart Hawthorne approached Darren afterward. "I owe you an apology. I was so focused on profit that I almost destroyed something my own grandfather benefited from." "You made the right choice in the end," Darren said. "That's what matters." As the sun began to set, people lingered, sharing food and stories. Children ran through the clearing, their laughter echoing off the trees. Darren watched it all with a sense of deep peace. He thought about his father's letter, about the true measure of a man being what he gives away rather than what he accumulates. For years, Darren had felt he had nothing to give. Now he understood that wasn't true. He had his effort, his commitment, his willingness to protect something larger than himself. Mrs. Pemberton joined him, following his gaze across the gathering. "Your father would be proud." "I hope so," Darren said quietly. "I know so. You honored his legacy, but more than that, you created your own." As darkness fell and people began to leave, Darren remained with Rook beside the pavilion. The golden key hung on a hook inside, where anyone could see it, a reminder of what small things can unlock when we have the courage to search for meaning. He was no longer the drifter dad, the man people avoided. He was the keeper of something precious, a steward of kindness. And for the first time in years, Darren Pritchard knew exactly where he belonged.